Welcome. You've found a space to slow down for a moment. Here, we explore stories from the past, distant, but still familiar in their humanity. Whether you're getting ready to sleep or just looking to unwind, I appreciate you being here. Let me know where you're tuning in from, what city or country, and what time it is when you press play. It's always interesting to see how history quietly connects us. If you find peace in this kind of calm storytelling, consider subscribing. There are plenty more stories ahead. Picture this: the sun rising over the shimmering Nile, casting its golden glow across the desert sands. Farmers tend to lush fields along the riverbanks, while boats laden with goods drift lazily downstream. In the distance, the peaks of the Great Pyramids pierce the azure sky, standing eternal watch over the kingdom of the pharaohs. This is ancient Egypt, a civilization of wonder and might that endured for over 3,000 years. From the towering monuments of Giza to the glittering treasures of Tutankhamun's tomb, it's a world that has long captivated imaginations across the globe. But life in the land of the Nile was not all gold and glory. Beneath the veneer of power and prosperity lay a society with stark divides between the haves and have-nots. And perhaps no group felt this inequality more keenly than women. To be sure, women in ancient Egypt enjoyed some freedoms and legal rights that set them apart from their counterparts in other ancient societies. They could own property, conduct business transactions, and even initiate divorce proceedings. Some royal and upper-class women like Nefertiti and Cleopatra wielded significant political influence. But make no mistake, this was still a deeply patriarchal world, one where women were considered inferior to men, both socially and legally. They were barred from holding positions of real power, shut out of the priesthood and the scribal class. They couldn't vote, couldn't serve on juries, couldn't independently make contracts. In short, they were second-class citizens. From birth to death, an ancient Egyptian woman's life was largely defined by her relationship to the men around her. As a child, she was under the control of her father. As an adult, her husband. If widowed, her son. At every stage, she needed a male guardian to represent her interests and make decisions on her behalf. This lack of autonomy, combined with limited economic and educational opportunities, meant that most women, even among the upper classes, had very circumscribed lives. If they were lucky enough to be literate, it was usually just enough to keep household accounts. Their career options were mostly limited to domestic work within the household, and of course their primary role was to bear children. Many children. To replace the staggering number lost to disease and accidents. It's estimated that around 1 in 3 women in ancient Egypt died in childbirth. Without modern medicine, even a seemingly uncomplicated pregnancy or delivery could quickly turn deadly. Those who did survive might be fortunate to live into their 30s or 40s, old age by the standards of the time. But even a long life was no picnic. An elderly widow with no sons to support her might find herself cast out on the street, forced to beg for food and shelter. The lucky ones might be taken in by other family or welcomed into the temple as a servant. But many surely met lonely, impoverished ends. For a glimpse of the realities of womanhood in ancient Egypt, we need look no further than the life of Queen Nefertiti. You might know her as the preternaturally beautiful face immortalized in limestone, gazing out across eternity with her enigmatic smile. And indeed, Nefertiti was renowned for her great beauty. But as a woman, even a queen, her power was always contingent on the whims of the men around her. As the first wife of the pharaoh Akhenaten, Nefertiti enjoyed great influence and prestige. She was depicted alongside her husband with a frequency and on a scale unprecedented for a queen. Some scholars even argue that she may have ruled as a co-regent for a time. But when Akhenaten died, Nefertiti disappears abruptly from the historical record. Her images and inscriptions were obliterated, her name erased as if she had never existed. Many Egyptologists believe this was the work of Akhenaten's successor, the young pharaoh Tutankhamun, as he sought to restore the old gods and orthodox religion that Akhenaten had abolished. The lesson that even the most powerful woman was still, in the end, at the mercy of the men who controlled the kingdom. Of course, the vast majority of women in ancient Egypt were not royalty or even nobility. They were the farmers, weavers, bakers, and brewers who formed the backbone of the Egyptian economy. And for these women, daily life was full of unrelenting labor. Without access to education, most worked in and around the home, grinding grain, baking bread, brewing beer, spinning linen, and tending to children and animals. It was hot, dirty, exhausting work, the same backbreaking grind day after day, with little rest or respite. Personal hygiene was another challenge in an age before indoor plumbing or sanitation. While the wealthy might enjoy the relative luxury of a limestone toilet seat and small bathing room, most Egyptians relieved themselves in chamber pots or in the river itself. An unsavory prospect, given that the Nile was also the primary source of drinking water. Diseases like typhoid, cholera, and dysentery were rampant. Surviving to adulthood at all was an accomplishment in a time when up to half of all children died before the age of 5. Those who did reach maturity usually didn't have long to savor it. Archaeologists tell us that the average life expectancy for a woman in ancient Egypt was around 30 years old, assuming she was fortunate enough to survive the gauntlet of repeated pregnancies and childbirths. Childbearing usually began early and ended late. It wasn't uncommon for girls to be married off as young as 12 or 13, usually to a much older man. These age gaps could be significant, 20, even 30 years between husband and wife. A 14-year-old girl might find herself married to a man in his 40s, a disparity that only underscored the power imbalance between the sexes. Successive pregnancies would follow one after the other in an attempt to produce as many healthy children as possible, especially sons to carry on the family name and lineage. With little to no formal medical care, each pregnancy was a game of Russian roulette. Any number of complications, from preeclampsia to obstructed labor, could easily result in the death of mother, baby, or both. The ancient Egyptians did have some surprisingly advanced medical texts for the time, many of which have survived to the present day. The Ebers Papyrus, for example, is a 110-page scroll from around 1500 BCE that covers a wide range of medical conditions and treatments, from heart disease to depression to birth control. But as advanced as some of this knowledge was, it was still primarily focused on the treatment of men. Women's health issues, from menstrual disorders to breast cancer, received comparatively little attention. And of course, without antibiotics, antiseptics, or any real understanding of germs and hygiene, even the most skilled physician could do little to stem the tide of infectious diseases that cut down so many young mothers in their prime. Against this grim backdrop, it's all the more remarkable when we encounter women in ancient Egypt who managed to rise above their prescribed roles and leave a mark on history. Women like Merit Ptah, the first recorded female physician in the world. Merit Ptah lived around 2700 BCE, during the early period of the Old Kingdom. She bore the title Chief Physician and appears to have attended primarily to the needs of women at the royal court. While little is known about her life, her very existence testifies to the fact that at least some women in ancient Egypt were able to break through the gender barriers and achieve positions of skill and prestige. Ironically, though, even as real Egyptian women struggled for basic freedoms and dignity, their idealized forms were being elevated to divine status in the official state religion. Goddesses like Isis, Hathor, Sekhmet, and Nut played vital roles in the Egyptian pantheon, reflecting different aspects of femininity, fertility and motherhood, love and beauty, wrath and warfare, creation and destruction. But here too, we see the double standard at play. While goddesses were venerated and temples built in their honor, mortal women were still excluded from the higher ranks of the priesthood. The loftiest religious role most women could hope to attain was that of a chantress, a kind of singer or musician who participated in temple ceremonies. But they were strictly segregated from the inner sanctums and the holiest of rites, which remained the exclusive domain of male priests. One of the few exceptions to this rule was Iset, a chantress of Amun during the 23rd dynasty of the Third Intermediate Period, around 800 BCE. Iset bore the grandiloquent title Chief of the Harem of Amun, which, despite its lascivious connotations, actually referred to an order of priestesses dedicated to the god Amun. As one of Amun's chantresses, she would have sung and performed music during religious festivals and processions. She also would have had a role in managing the sizable estates and holdings belonging to Amun's cult. It was a rare position of some authority for a woman, but still ultimately subordinate to the male high priests. For royal and upper-class women, life may have been materially comfortable, but it was no less circumscribed by rigid gender expectations. Wives and mothers of the pharaoh might wield some degree of influence behind the scenes, but their power was always borrowed, never fully their own. Even mighty queens like Tia, Nefertiti, and Nefertari governed at the pleasure of their divine husbands and could be summarily cast aside when they were no longer of use or interest. In 3,000 years of ancient Egyptian history, only a handful of women ever managed to rule as pharaohs in their own right, and even they did so only briefly and with varying degrees of success. The most famous of these is undoubtedly Hatshepsut, the fifth pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, who ruled for over 20 prosperous years in the 15th century BCE. The daughter of the great warrior pharaoh Thutmose I, Hatshepsut was never supposed to inherit the throne in her own right. But when her husband and half-brother, Thutmose II, died prematurely, leaving only an infant son to succeed him, Hatshepsut stepped into the breach, first as regent and then, audaciously, as pharaoh herself. To legitimize her reign, Hatshepsut set about systematically masculinizing her image. In statues and reliefs, she is depicted wearing the traditional pharaonic regalia, the crown, the false beard, even the shendit kilt. She referred to herself using male pronouns and titles. For all intents and purposes, she became a man in both form and function, and by all accounts she ruled well and effectively, ushering in a period of peace and plenty for Egypt. She expanded trade networks, commissioned grand building projects like her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, and even mounted a successful military campaign in Nubia. But for all her achievements, Hatshepsut's legacy was ultimately not secure. After her death, her names and images were systematically chiseled out of monuments, her statues smashed, her accomplishments attributed to the male pharaohs who came before and after. It was as if the powers that be were trying to erase the memory of a woman who dared to rule as a man. Such was the fate of even the most exceptional women in ancient Egypt. No matter how high they might rise or what they might achieve, their place in society was always precarious. Their hard-won gains easily eroded or erased entirely by the capricious currents of male-dominated power structures. As the sun sets over the Nile and the last embers of our story flicker and fade, it's hard not to feel a sense of melancholy for all the women of ancient Egypt whose lives were so constrained, whose potential was so blunted by the rigid hierarchies of their time. For every Nefertiti or Hatshepsut who managed to break the mold, how many thousands of anonymous women lived and died in obscurity, their hopes and dreams buried with them in the sand? But perhaps there is a glimmer of hope to be found in their stories as well, a reminder that even in the most oppressive of circumstances, the human spirit still yearns to be free, to stretch beyond the confines of the roles and expectations placed upon it, that women, then as now, have always found ways to resist, to persevere, to leave their mark, however subtle or fleeting. So let us remember the women of ancient Egypt, both the great and the small. Let us honour their struggles and their triumphs, their joys and their sorrows. And let us continue to work towards a world where every woman, no matter her station or circumstance, has the freedom and the power to shape her own destiny. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Nile as Egyptian women began their daily rituals, but these weren't the leisurely beauty routines we might imagine today. For most women, preparing for the day meant carefully balancing survival with the relentless expectations of a society that judged their worth by impossible standards. Consider Nefret, a farmer's wife living near Memphis around 1400 BCE. Before dawn broke fully, she was already grinding grain with a stone quern, her hands developing the calluses that marked every working woman of her time. The rhythmic scraping sound would wake her children, who knew to remain quiet until mother had prepared the morning bread. There was no rushing this process, no shortcuts that wouldn't result in gritty, inedible loaves that could break teeth or cause the painful dental abscesses that plagued Egyptian society. But even as Nefret worked, she was acutely aware of her appearance. Egyptian women, regardless of social class, were expected to maintain certain standards of beauty and cleanliness that required considerable effort and resources most could barely afford. The kohl that lined her eyes wasn't merely decorative. It served practical purposes in the desert climate, protecting against the harsh glare of the sun and helping prevent eye infections. Yet obtaining quality kohl required trading precious resources, and the daily application took time that could have been spent on other survival tasks. The pressure to remain beautiful was particularly intense because a woman's value in Egyptian society was so closely tied to her physical appeal and fertility. Archaeological evidence suggests that women who failed to maintain their appearance or who aged visibly often found themselves cast aside by husbands who could easily obtain divorces. Unlike men who gained status through wealth, military service, or religious roles, women had few paths to security beyond their physical attributes and their ability to bear children, particularly sons. This created a cruel paradox for women like Nefret. The very work necessary for survival, grinding grain, hauling water, tending fires, working in the fields under the scorching sun, was slowly destroying the beauty that society demanded she maintain. Her hands grew rough, her back bent from carrying heavy loads, her skin darkened and weathered despite her best efforts to protect it. Every day was a battle against the inevitable effects of a hard life, fought with inadequate tools and insufficient resources. The beauty standards themselves were punishingly specific. Egyptian art and literature celebrated women with pale skin, suggesting they were wealthy enough to avoid outdoor labor. They idealized slender figures, elaborate hairstyles, and flawless makeup application. For working women, achieving these standards required sacrifices that often compromised their health and their family's well-being. Take the matter of hair, for instance. Elite women wore elaborate wigs made from human hair, styled into complex braids and adorned with gold ornaments. These wigs were not only expensive, but required constant maintenance and caused scalp problems from poor ventilation in the desert heat. Working women couldn't afford such luxuries, but they were still expected to keep their hair neat and styled. Many resorted to shaving their heads and wearing simple linen head coverings, but this practical solution was seen as a sign of lower status. The cosmetics that were essential to Egyptian feminine identity also came with hidden costs. The lead-based kohl that created the dramatic eye makeup so characteristic of Egyptian beauty was slowly poisoning the women who wore it daily. The red ochre used for lip and cheek color could cause skin irritation and allergic reactions. The perfumed oils and unguents that wealthy women applied liberally were often rancid or contaminated, leading to skin infections and other health problems. Even the clothing that seems so elegant in tomb paintings and sculptures was often uncomfortable and impractical. The fine linen garments that we associate with ancient Egypt were expensive and required careful maintenance. Most women owned only one or two good garments, which they had to preserve for public appearances, while doing their daily work in rough, patched clothing that provided little protection from the elements. The jewelry that adorned Egyptian women in artistic depictions was another source of both status and suffering. Heavy gold collars and bracelets were signs of wealth and beauty, but they were also uncomfortable to wear during physical labor and made women targets for robbery. Even simple copper or bronze ornaments could cause skin irritation and infections, particularly in the hot, humid climate along the Nile. Perhaps most tragically, the emphasis on youthful beauty meant that women faced a constant countdown to obsolescence. In a culture where life expectancy was short and childbirth was dangerous, women had only a brief window in which they could hope to attract and keep a husband's attention. The pressure to remain young-looking led some women to dangerous practices, using toxic substances to lighten their skin or maintain their figures. The contrast between artistic representations and lived reality was stark. The women depicted in tomb paintings and sculptures appear serene, perfectly groomed, and eternally youthful. But these were idealized images, often commissioned by wealthy men to represent their fantasies rather than document reality. The actual women of ancient Egypt lived with constant anxiety about their appearance, knowing that their security and survival depended on meeting impossible standards with inadequate resources. This beauty culture also created divisions among women themselves. Those who could afford better cosmetics, clothing, and adornments looked down on their less fortunate sisters. The beauty standards served as another way to reinforce social hierarchies, making it clear at a glance who belonged to which class. A woman's appearance became a form of social passport, determining where she could go, whom she could speak to, and how she would be treated. The irony was that many of the women we admire today for their beauty, like Nefertiti herself, likely struggled with the same pressures and insecurities. Even queens were not immune to the fear of aging, the anxiety about maintaining their husband's interest, or the constant work required to meet society's expectations. The famous bust of Nefertiti, with its perfect features and serene expression, may actually represent the triumph of artistic idealization over the harsh realities of even royal women's lives. As the sun climbed higher and the day grew hotter, women like Nefret would continue their endless cycle of work and beauty maintenance, grinding grain with hands adorned with simple copper rings, drawing water while wearing their best linen dress, always conscious that their appearance was being judged and their worth calculated. It was an exhausting way to live, but in ancient Egypt, it was the only way for women to survive. The beauty standards that governed Egyptian women's lives weren't just about vanity or fashion. They were about power, survival, and the complex negotiations that women had to make in a society that offered them few alternatives. Understanding this reality helps us see beyond the golden artifacts and perfect sculptures to the lived experiences of real women who struggled daily with impossible expectations while building one of history's greatest civilizations. But if you thought the physical dangers and social constraints were the worst of it, let me tell you about something that made every other hardship pale in comparison: the beauty standards. The crushing, relentless, soul-destroying expectations of what an Egyptian woman should look like. And trust me, Instagram filters have nothing on the ancient Egyptian beauty industry. Picture this. You're a young woman in ancient Egypt. Every morning, you wake up knowing that your entire worth as a human being will be judged by how closely you resemble a painted goddess on a tomb wall. No pressure, right? The ideal Egyptian woman was supposed to have skin like polished ivory, eyes lined with perfect precision, hair that never moved out of place, and a figure that suggested you'd never worked a day in your life. Which was particularly cruel considering most women spent their days hauling water, grinding grain, and doing back-breaking agricultural work under the scorching desert sun. But here's where it gets really twisted. Achieving this impossible standard required using cosmetics that were literally poisonous. That beautiful black coal that outlined Egyptian eyes, made from lead sulfide. Those vibrant red lips, created with mercury-based pigments. The pale foundation that made skin look ethereal, often contained arsenic. Women were slowly poisoning themselves to death in the name of beauty, and they knew it. Egyptian medical texts warned about the dangers of these cosmetics, but social pressure was so intense that women used them anyway. Because the alternative, appearing in public without makeup, was social suicide. Let me tell you about Ankhesenamun, a noblewoman whose mummy was discovered with clear signs of lead poisoning from decades of coal use. Her teeth had fallen out, her bones were brittle, and her organs showed extensive damage. But her tomb paintings show her depicted as eternally beautiful, her eyes perfectly lined, her skin flawless. Even in death, the fiction had to be maintained. And the hair. Sweet mother of Isis, the hair situation was a nightmare. Natural hair was considered so unacceptable that women routinely shaved their heads completely bald and wore elaborate wigs made from human hair, horsehair, or plant fibers. These wigs could weigh up to 15 pounds and were absolutely stifling in the Egyptian heat. But it gets worse. The most fashionable wigs were made from the hair of Nubian slaves, and the darker and more exotic the hair, the higher your status. So not only were women literally carrying the weight of beauty standards on their heads, they were participating in a system that commodified the bodies of enslaved people. The wig industry was massive and merciless. Wealthy families employed full-time wig specialists who would spend hours each day maintaining these elaborate headdresses. The process involved heating the hair with hot irons, applying perfumed oils that often contained toxic ingredients, and arranging it into increasingly complex styles that required architectural engineering to maintain. Women couldn't even sleep normally. They had to use wooden headrests that kept their wigs elevated, leading to chronic neck pain and insomnia. Many developed permanent spinal curvatures from sleeping in unnatural positions night after night, year after year. And let's talk about the clothing. Those flowing, elegant linen garments you see in Egyptian art. They were basically see-through. The finest linen was so sheer it was transparent, which meant women were essentially walking around naked while pretending to be modestly dressed. This created a bizarre situation where women were simultaneously expected to be pure and chaste while also being sexually available for visual consumption. The jewelry was another torture device masquerading as ornamentation. Gold was incredibly heavy, and wealthy women wore so much of it that they could barely move. Cleopatra supposedly wore necklaces so massive that she needed servants to help her turn her head. The weight caused chronic back problems, and many Egyptian mummies show evidence of compressed vertebrae from a lifetime of carrying ornamental burdens. But perhaps the most insidious part of the beauty system was how it created a hierarchy of suffering among women themselves. Wealthy women could afford the finest cosmetics, the most elaborate wigs, the heaviest jewelry. They poisoned themselves with the best materials. Poor women had to make do with cheaper, often more dangerous alternatives or face social ostracism for not meeting beauty standards they couldn't afford to achieve. This created a twisted form of competition, where women measured their worth not by their intelligence, kindness, or accomplishments, but by how effectively they could damage their own bodies in pursuit of an impossible ideal. The beauty rituals themselves were time-consuming ordeals that consumed hours of every day. A wealthy woman's morning routine involved having her head shaved by servants, her wig fitted and arranged, her face painted with multiple layers of toxic cosmetics, her body oiled and perfumed, and her jewelry carefully positioned to create the right visual effect. The process could take 3 to 4 hours, and it had to be repeated daily. And here's the cruelest irony of all. The goddesses that Egyptian women were trying to emulate, Isis, Hathor, Nephthys, were depicted as eternally youthful and beautiful precisely because they were immortal. They never aged, never got sick, never suffered from lead poisoning or back problems from heavy wigs. Egyptian women were literally killing themselves trying to look like beings who couldn't die. The psychological toll was immense. Women internalized these impossible standards to the point where they genuinely believed their worth as human beings depended on their appearance. Letters and diary fragments that have survived show women expressing deep shame and self-hatred when they couldn't maintain the required beauty standards due to illness, pregnancy, or simply aging. And aging, oh gods, aging was treated like a moral failing. Older women were expected to maintain the same appearance standards as teenagers, leading to increasingly desperate measures as the years went by. Some women underwent primitive cosmetic procedures that often resulted in disfigurement or death. Others simply withdrew from society entirely, unable to bear the shame of their changing appearance. The beauty industry also created a whole class of women whose lives were devoted to maintaining these standards in others. Professional cosmeticians, wig makers, and beauty servants lived in a strange liminal space where they were essential to the functioning of elite society, but were also looked down upon for their association with vanity and artifice. Even death couldn't free women from these expectations. The mummification process included elaborate cosmetic procedures to ensure that wealthy women looked beautiful for eternity. Their faces were painted, their bodies positioned to appear youthful, their wigs and jewelry carefully arranged. They were buried with cosmetic supplies so they could maintain their appearance in the afterlife. The really tragic part is that we know from medical examinations of mummies that many of these women were intelligent, capable, accomplished individuals who could have contributed so much more to their society if they hadn't been trapped in this system of ornamental self-destruction. So the next time you complain about modern beauty standards, remember the women of ancient Egypt who literally poisoned themselves to death trying to achieve an impossible ideal, who carried crushing weights on their heads and backs, who spent half their waking hours applying toxic makeup, who lived in constant fear that their appearance might not be perfect enough to justify their existence. Their suffering was real, their pain was genuine, and their stories deserve to be remembered not as cautionary tales about vanity, but as testimony to the incredible lengths women will go to when their worth is measured solely by how they look. Because in the end, the most beautiful thing about these women wasn't their perfectly lined eyes or their elaborate wigs. It was their resilience, their ability to find meaning and connection, despite a system designed to reduce them to decorative objects. They loved their children, supported their friends, and somehow maintained their humanity even as society tried to strip it away from them. The heavy wooden doors of the temple swing shut behind you, echoing through corridors lined with painted walls where gods and goddesses watch with eternal eyes. Here, in the sacred spaces of ancient Egypt, women found both sanctuary and limitation, power and constraint. Tonight, we delve into the spiritual lives of Egyptian women, where divine femininity reigned supreme even as mortal women struggled for their place among the sacred mysteries. Picture yourself in the shadow of Karnak, the great temple complex where the morning sun casts long shadows across courtyards filled with the scent of frankincense and myrrh. The air thrums with the low chanting of priests, but listen carefully, and you'll hear another voice rising above the masculine chorus. It belongs to Iset, a chantress of Amun, one of the few women permitted to serve in the inner sanctums of Egypt's most powerful deity. Iset's story illuminates the complex relationship between Egyptian women and the divine realm. Born into a family of temple servants during the 20th dynasty, She rose through careful dedication and undeniable talent to become one of the most respected religious women of her time. Her tomb in the Valley of the Kings, a rare honor for a non-royal woman, tells us everything we need to know about the heights a woman could reach in religious service and the limitations that still bound her. As a chantress, Iset's voice carried the prayers of the kingdom to the ears of Amun. She performed the sacred songs that maintained cosmic order, her melodies weaving through temple halls during the daily rituals that kept the sun rising and the Nile flowing. Yet for all her spiritual authority, she remained subordinate to the male priests who controlled the temple hierarchy. Her power was real but circumscribed, influential yet dependent on male approval. The Egyptian pantheon offered women a curious paradox. While flesh and blood women faced strict limitations, the goddesses commanded absolute reverence. Isis, the divine mother and protector, wielded magic powerful enough to resurrect the dead. Hathor governed love, beauty, and joy, her festivals drawing crowds who danced and drank in ecstatic celebration. Sekhmet, the lioness goddess, brought both plague and healing, her rage capable of destroying armies. These goddesses weren't passive divine consorts, but active forces who shaped destiny itself. Isis didn't merely mourn her murdered husband Osiris, she gathered his scattered remains, breathed life back into his body, and conceived their son Horus through sheer magical will. Her determination to restore order from chaos made her the most beloved deity in Egypt, worshipped from the pharaoh's palace to the humblest mud brick house. Yet this divine feminine power created a strange tension for mortal women. They could worship goddesses who commanded gods, but they themselves were barred from the priesthood's highest ranks. They could pray to Isis for protection in childbirth, but they couldn't serve as high priestesses in her temples. The very goddesses who embodied ultimate feminine authority presided over a religious system that kept flesh and blood women in supporting roles. The daily reality for most Egyptian women meant navigating a spiritual landscape where the feminine divine was everywhere and nowhere. In their homes, they maintained small shrines to household goddesses, burning incense and leaving offerings of bread and beer. They participated in religious festivals, dancing in honor of Hathor, or mourning with Isis during the passion plays that reenacted Osiris's death and resurrection. But when it came to formal religious authority, women found themselves channeled into specific limited roles. They could serve as musicians and dancers, their bodies and voices adding beauty to temple ceremonies. They could work as temple servants, cleaning sacred spaces and preparing ritual offerings. A select few, like Iset, might rise to become chantresses, their trained voices carrying the words that maintained divine favor. The role of chantress represented the pinnacle of religious achievement for most women. These were not casual temple musicians, but highly trained professionals who underwent years of education in sacred texts, ritual procedures, and musical performance. They learned to read hieroglyphs, memorized countless hymns, and mastered the complex rhythms that accompanied religious ceremonies. Their voices became instruments of divine communication, carrying human prayers to the gods and bringing divine blessing back to the mortal realm. Iset herself exemplified this sacred calling. Archaeological evidence from her tomb reveals a woman of considerable education and refinement. Her burial goods include musical instruments, religious texts, and jewelry befitting her high status. The paintings on her tomb walls show her performing before the gods, her sistrum raised in eternal song, her face serene with spiritual devotion. Yet, even Iset's remarkable achievements remind us of the boundaries that contained women's religious lives. She served Amun, the king of gods, but she never held the title of high priest. She participated in the most sacred rituals, but she couldn't perform the secret rites reserved for men. Her voice carried divine authority, but her gender limited how far that authority could extend. The goddess Hathor, offers another window into women's spiritual experiences. Known as the Golden One, she governed music, dance, love, and fertility. Her festivals were among the most joyous in the Egyptian calendar, featuring wine, music, and uninhibited celebration. Women played central roles in these festivities, dancing with abandon, singing until their voices grew hoarse, drinking until the boundaries between human and divine blurred. These Hathoric festivals provided one of the few spaces where women could express themselves with complete freedom. Social conventions relaxed, hierarchies dissolved, and the feminine divine took center stage. Women who spent most of their lives in quiet domestic service suddenly found themselves at the heart of religious celebration, their bodies and voices essential to maintaining cosmic harmony. But even these moments of liberation carried their own constraints. Women's religious ecstasy was acceptable only within carefully defined boundaries. They could dance wildly for Hathor, but they couldn't claim priestly authority. They could sing divine hymns, but they couldn't interpret sacred texts. Their spiritual expression was valued precisely because it remained safely contained within feminine roles. The mystery religions offered another avenue for women's spiritual participation. The cult of Isis, in particular, attracted female devotees who found in the goddess a model of feminine power and resilience. Isis had suffered the ultimate loss when her husband was murdered, yet she had triumphed through magic, determination, and love. For women facing their own losses and struggles, her story provided both comfort and inspiration. These mystery cults operated partly outside the formal temple hierarchy, creating space for women to develop their own spiritual authority. Female initiates could rise through ranks of sacred knowledge, learning secret rituals and gaining access to hidden teachings. While they never challenged male religious dominance directly, they created parallel structures where women's spiritual gifts could flourish. The role of wise women and healers occupied a liminal space between official religion and folk practice. These women, often elderly and experienced, served their communities as midwives, herbalists, and spiritual advisors. They knew which prayers to recite during difficult births, which amulets protected against the evil eye, which rituals ensured a good harvest. Their knowledge was partly practical, partly magical, always essential. They understood that the health of the body and the favor of the gods were intimately connected. A woman suffering from infertility might need both medicinal herbs and protective amulets. A family facing economic hardship required practical advice and spiritual intervention in equal measure. These wise women operated in the spaces between formal religion and daily life. Their authority derived not from official appointment, but from demonstrated effectiveness. Communities turned to them because they delivered results. Their healing touch and spiritual insight, providing comfort that the distant temple hierarchy couldn't match. Yet their very effectiveness made them vulnerable. Knowledge of herbs and healing could easily be reinterpreted as witchcraft. Skill in divination might be seen as trafficking with dangerous spirits. The same abilities that made them valuable to their communities could become evidence against them if circumstances changed or enemies emerged. The worship of household gods provided another realm where women exercised spiritual authority. In the privacy of their homes, women maintained shrines to protective deities like Bez and Taweret. These gods weren't grand cosmic forces, but intimate protectors who guarded children, ensured safe births, and warded off everyday dangers. Women's relationship with these household deities was immediate and personal. They spoke to them as they would to beloved relatives, sharing their fears and hopes, asking for help with sick children or difficult husbands. These gods listened to women's prayers without the mediation of male priests, creating a direct spiritual connection that bypassed official religious channels. The evidence of women's spiritual lives survives in countless small objects, amulets worn against the skin, figurines buried in house foundations, offering bowls stained with libations of milk and honey. These humble artifacts reveal a rich spiritual world where women sought divine protection for themselves and their families. Their faith expressed through daily acts of devotion rather than grand public ceremonies. Even in death, women's spiritual journey continued under different rules than men's. While male priests and nobles could expect elaborate mummification and richly appointed tombs, most women faced simpler burial rites. Their afterlife prospects depended largely on their relationships with male family members, their own spiritual achievements often secondary to their roles as wives and mothers. Yet some women, like the Chantresse Issei, transcended these limitations through exceptional devotion and skill. Their tombs became testimonies to lives spent in sacred service, their mummified bodies prepared with the same care given to high-ranking priests. In death, if not always in life, their spiritual achievements earned them recognition and respect. The tension between divine feminine power and mortal feminine limitation created a unique spiritual landscape for Egyptian women. They lived in a world where the most powerful deities were female, where goddesses commanded absolute reverence, where feminine wisdom and intuition were considered essential to cosmic order. Yet they themselves were excluded from the highest levels of religious authority, their spiritual gifts channeled into supporting roles rather than leadership positions. This paradox shaped every aspect of women's religious experience. They could worship all-powerful goddesses, but couldn't claim similar authority for themselves. They could participate in sacred rituals, but couldn't control them. They could serve the divine, but couldn't speak with its full voice. Perhaps this is why figures like Iset shine so brightly in the historical record. Her achievement lay not in challenging the system, but in rising as high as possible within its constraints. Her voice carried divine authority, even if her gender limited its reach. Her spiritual gifts found expression even if they couldn't break free from traditional boundaries. As we consider the spiritual lives of ancient Egyptian women, we see both limitation and transcendence, constraint and creativity. These women found ways to connect with the divine despite the barriers placed before them. They created their own spiritual spaces, developed their own forms of religious authority, and maintained their own relationships with the gods. Their legacy reminds us that spirituality cannot be contained by institutional boundaries. While they may have been excluded from formal religious power, Egyptian women created rich spiritual lives that sustained them through the challenges of their time. Their faith found expression in countless small acts of devotion, their voices joining the eternal chorus that connected earth to heaven. In the painted halls of ancient temples, the voice of the Chantresse still echoes, carrying prayers across the centuries. Her song reminds us that spiritual authority comes not just from official appointment, but from depth of devotion, that divine connection transcends human hierarchies, and that the sacred feminine finds expression even when formal religion tries to contain it. The gods and goddesses may have demanded worship, but they also offered comfort, protection, and hope. For Egyptian women, navigating a world that limited their options and circumscribed their authority, the divine realm provided both refuge and inspiration. In worshipping powerful goddesses, they glimpsed possibilities that their own lives couldn't fully realize. In serving the gods, they found purpose that transcended domestic constraints. As the temple doors close and the incense fades, we're left with the echo of ancient voices raised in sacred song. These women may have lived within limitations, but their spirits soared beyond earthly boundaries. Their faith sustained them, their devotion elevated them, and their legacy continues to inspire us across the vast expanse of time. But even as the divine realm offered women like Isis and Hathor as symbols of ultimate feminine power, the reality for mortal women remained harsh and constrained. The very goddesses who were worshipped for their strength and independence served as a painful reminder of what earthly women could never truly possess. And nowhere was this contradiction more apparent than in the spiritual lives of ancient Egyptian women themselves. For while the temples gleamed with images of powerful goddesses, the actual religious hierarchy remained stubbornly male-dominated. Women could serve in temples, yes, but almost always in secondary roles. They could be chantresses, singers, dancers in religious ceremonies. They could tend the sacred fires and prepare offerings. But the highest priestly positions, the ones that wielded real spiritual authority and political influence, remained closed to them. Consider the role of the god's wife of Amun, one of the few positions of genuine religious power available to women. This title, held by select royal women, carried enormous prestige and influence. The god's wife was considered the earthly consort of the god Amun, one of Egypt's most important deities. She controlled vast temple estates, commanded hundreds of servants, and played a crucial role in religious ceremonies. Yet even this exalted position came with its own form of imprisonment. The god's wife was required to remain celibate, to have no earthly husband or children. Her spiritual marriage to Amun meant the end of any hope for a normal family life. It was power, yes, but power that demanded the sacrifice of the very things that defined womanhood in ancient Egyptian society. For most women, religious participation meant something far more modest and personal. They worshipped household gods in the privacy of their homes, small shrines tucked into corners where they could pray for protection during childbirth, for the health of their children, for their husband's safe return from trading expeditions. These domestic rituals were deeply meaningful, but they were also invisible to the larger world, unrecorded in the grand temple inscriptions that have survived to tell us about ancient Egyptian religion. The goddess Taweret, depicted as a pregnant hippopotamus standing upright, was one of the most beloved deities among common women. She protected women during childbirth. That terrifying passage that claimed so many lives. Small amulets of Taweret were worn by pregnant women, carved figurines placed in birthing chambers. Here was a goddess who understood their fears, their pain, their desperate hope for survival. But perhaps no aspect of women's spiritual lives reveals the constraints they face more clearly than their relationship with magic and healing. In ancient Egypt, the line between medicine and magic was thin to non-existent. Healing involved not just herbs and treatments, but spells, incantations, and appeals to the gods, and women, particularly older women with knowledge of traditional remedies, were often the ones who possessed this wisdom. Yet this knowledge was dangerous. A woman who was too skilled at healing, too successful with her remedies, might find herself accused of witchcraft or dark magic. The same skills that made her valuable to her community could also make her a target for suspicion and persecution. It was a cruel irony that the very abilities that allowed women to help and heal could be turned against them as evidence of supernatural corruption. The story of Merit Ptah, that pioneering physician we encountered earlier, takes on new meaning in this context. For a woman to rise to the position of chief physician in ancient Egypt required not just extraordinary skill, but also the ability to navigate a world where female knowledge was both desperately needed and deeply mistrusted. She had to be brilliant enough to save lives, but careful enough not to appear too powerful, too independent, too threatening to the established order. This tension between divine feminine power and earthly feminine constraint created a unique form of spiritual suffering for Egyptian women. They could see in their goddesses what they themselves might be capable of. Isis, the master of magic; Hathor, the embodiment of joy and love; Sekhmet, the fierce protector. Yet they knew that any attempt to claim such power for themselves would be met with swift and harsh punishment, and so they found other ways to connect with the divine. They participated in festivals where, for brief moments, the normal social order was suspended and women could dance, sing, and celebrate with unusual freedom. They made pilgrimages to sacred sites, journeys that took them away from the confines of home and allowed them to experience something approaching spiritual independence. They also developed rich traditions of folk religion, practices that existed alongside but separate from the official temple cult. These traditions, passed down from mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter, preserved ancient wisdom about healing, protection, and spiritual power. They were the underground rivers of Egyptian spirituality, flowing beneath the surface of official religion. In death, too, women found a kind of spiritual equality that had been denied them in life. The afterlife, as the Egyptians conceived it, was not divided by gender. Both men and women could hope to pass through the trials of the underworld and reach the blessed fields of the afterlife. The same spells that protected male souls could protect female ones. In death, at least, the goddess's power extended equally to all their children. But perhaps the most poignant aspect of women's spiritual lives in ancient Egypt was their role as keepers of memory and tradition. While men dominated the official priesthood and controlled the written religious texts, women were often the ones who preserved the oral traditions, the stories, the songs, the practices that gave meaning to daily life. They were the living libraries of spiritual wisdom, even if that wisdom was never formally recognized or recorded. This hidden spiritual life of Egyptian women reveals something profound about the human capacity for faith and resilience. Even in a world that systematically denied them power and agency, women found ways to maintain their connection to the divine. They created sacred spaces in their homes, their hearts, their communities. They honored the goddesses not just in grand temples, but in quiet moments of prayer and hope. Their spiritual legacy is written not in stone monuments, but in the traditions that survived, the stories that endured, the quiet faith that sustained them through lives of hardship and constraint. They may not have been able to wield the formal power of the priesthood, but they possessed something perhaps even more precious, an unshakable connection to the sacred that no earthly authority could take away. And in this, perhaps, they achieved a kind of victory. For while the pharaohs and high priests have long since turned to dust, the spiritual wisdom of Egyptian women lives on, a testament to the enduring power of faith to survive even the most oppressive circumstances. Their voices may have been silenced in the official records, but their spirits continue to speak to us across the millennia, reminding us that the divine feminine cannot be contained by human law or custom, that it flows like the Nile itself, eternal, life-giving, and ultimately unstoppable. The morning sun cast long shadows across the temple courtyards of ancient Egypt as priestesses began their daily rituals, their linen robes rustling softly in the desert breeze. Yet for all the reverence these women commanded within sacred walls, their spiritual lives existed within carefully constructed boundaries, shaped by a complex web of divine feminine power and earthly patriarchal control. In the pantheon of ancient Egypt, goddesses reigned supreme in ways that might surprise us today. Isis, the great mother goddess, was revered as the protector of the dead and the mistress of magic. Her power extended across the known world, her cult spreading far beyond Egypt's borders to Greece, Rome, and beyond. Hathor, the cow-headed goddess of love and music, presided over fertility and joy, her festivals drawing thousands of celebrants who danced and drank in ecstatic worship. But perhaps most intriguingly, there was Sekhmet, the lioness-headed goddess of war and healing, whose very breath was said to create the desert winds. These weren't gentle, nurturing deities confined to domestic spheres. They were cosmic forces wielding power over life and death, creation and destruction. Yet this divine feminine power created a fascinating paradox in Egyptian society. While goddesses commanded absolute reverence, mortal women found themselves largely excluded from the highest levels of religious authority. The great temples of Karnak and Luxor, the sacred precincts where the most important rituals were performed, remained predominantly male domains. Women could serve as priestesses, yes, but typically in supporting roles. They were chanters and musicians, dancers and offering bearers. They maintained the sacred flames and prepared the ritual foods. But the high priests, those who entered the innermost sanctuaries and communed directly with the gods, were almost exclusively men. Consider the role of the chantress, one of the most prestigious religious positions available to women. These priestesses, like Iset Nofret, who served in the temple of Amun during the New Kingdom, were highly educated and deeply respected. They learned complex hymns and ritual songs, mastering the intricate melodies believed to please the gods and maintain cosmic harmony. The daily life of a chantress was demanding and spiritually fulfilling. She would rise before dawn to participate in the morning rituals, her voice joining with others in haunting melodies that echoed through the temple halls. She memorized hundreds of sacred texts, understood the theological significance of every gesture and offering, and served as an intermediary between the divine and mortal realms. Yet even these accomplished women operated within strict limitations. They could not enter the Holy of Holies, could not touch the most sacred statues of the gods, and could not perform the most important ceremonies. Their knowledge was vast, but their authority was circumscribed. This religious hierarchy reflected broader social attitudes about women's spiritual nature. Egyptian theology taught that women possessed a special connection to magic and the divine feminine, but this very connection was seen as potentially dangerous. Women's monthly cycles linked them to lunar rhythms and cosmic forces that were both sacred and unpredictable. The concept of Isfet, or cosmic chaos, was often associated with uncontrolled feminine power. While goddesses like Isis could wield magic beneficially, mortal women who displayed too much spiritual authority risked being seen as disruptive to Mayat, the divine order that kept the universe in balance. This tension played out dramatically in the story of Hatshepsut, who not only ruled as pharaoh, but also claimed the ultimate religious authority that came with that position. To legitimize her unprecedented power, she had to literally remake herself in masculine terms, wearing the traditional false beard of kingship and referring to herself with male pronouns in official inscriptions. Even then, her religious authority remained controversial. Traditional priests, uncomfortable with a female pharaoh performing the most sacred rituals, may have contributed to the systematic erasure of her name from temple walls after her death. The divine feminine was welcome in the form of goddesses, but mortal women who claimed too much religious power challenged the fundamental order of Egyptian society. For ordinary women, spiritual life centered around domestic religion and popular cults. In homes throughout Egypt, women maintained small shrines to household gods, like Bez, the protective dwarf deity, and Taweret, the hippo goddess who guarded pregnant women and children. These intimate religious practices allowed women to exercise spiritual authority within their own spheres. Women also played crucial roles in funerary religion, preparing the dead for their journey to the afterlife. They were the professional mourners whose ritual wailing was believed necessary to awaken the deceased in the next world. They prepared the foods and offerings that would sustain the dead, and they maintained the tomb cults that kept their ancestors' memories alive. The goddess cults offered another avenue for women's religious expression. The festivals of Hathor were particularly important, featuring music, dancing, and ritual intoxication that temporarily overturned normal social hierarchies. During these celebrations, women could express ecstatic devotion and spiritual passion in ways normally forbidden to them. But even these moments of religious freedom came with boundaries. The festival of Hathor might allow women to dance and drink, but it was still overseen by male priests. Women might lead the mourning rituals, but the ultimate authority over death and resurrection belonged to male deities like Osiris. The position of God's wife of Amun represented perhaps the highest religious office a woman could achieve in ancient Egypt. This role, which reached its peak during the late period, granted enormous wealth and influence to a select few royal women. The god's wife controlled vast temple estates, commanded hundreds of servants, and wielded political power that rivaled that of the pharaoh himself. Yet even this exalted position came with restrictions. The god's wife had to remain celibate, symbolically married only to the god Amun. She could adopt a successor, but could never bear children of her own. Her power, however great, existed only in relation to a male deity and required the sacrifice of her own potential for motherhood. These religious constraints reflected deeper theological beliefs about women's spiritual nature. Egyptian religion taught that the feminine principle was essential to creation and renewal, but it also held that feminine power needed to be carefully channeled and controlled. The annual flooding of the Nile, which brought life to Egypt, was seen as a feminine force, but one that could also bring destruction if not properly managed. Women's exclusion from the highest levels of the priesthood wasn't seen as discrimination, but as cosmic necessity. The most sacred rituals, particularly those involving the daily care of the god's statue, required ritual purity that was believed to be compromised by women's biological functions. Menstruation, childbirth, and even sexual activity were seen as creating spiritual pollution that could anger the gods. This created a profound irony in Egyptian religion. The goddesses who were central to Egyptian theology embodied feminine power in its most exalted form, yet mortal women were often seen as spiritually inferior to men. The divine feminine was cosmic and transcendent, while earthly femininity was biological and limiting. Despite these restrictions, many women found ways to exercise spiritual authority and influence. The wives of high priests often wielded considerable power behind the scenes, managing temple finances and overseeing religious education. Women from priestly families passed down religious knowledge to their daughters, creating informal networks of female religious expertise. The mystery cults that flourished in later periods of Egyptian history offered new opportunities for women's spiritual expression. These secretive religious movements, often centered around goddesses like Isis, promised direct spiritual experience and salvation to their initiates regardless of gender. In these contexts, women could achieve spiritual authority based on their personal religious experiences rather than their social status. As we drift towards sleep, we can imagine these ancient women, the chantresses raising their voices in dawn hymns, the priestesses tending sacred flames, the mothers whispering prayers over their children's beds. They lived within constraints we can barely comprehend, yet they found ways to connect with the divine, to exercise spiritual authority, and to maintain the cosmic balance that kept their world functioning. Their legacy reminds us that the relationship between women and religious power has always been complex, shaped by both reverence for the feminine divine and fear of women's earthly authority. In honoring their struggles and achievements, we acknowledge the long history of women's spiritual resilience and their enduring quest for religious expression and recognition. The temple bells have fallen silent now, the incense has burned away, and the priestesses have completed their eternal duties. Rest now, knowing that their voices still echo in the desert wind. Their devotion still shines in the stars they once used to navigate the sacred calendar, and their wisdom still flows like the Nile through the dreams of those who remember their names. The sacred smoke rose from countless temples throughout the Nile Valley, carrying prayers to the heavens in languages both spoken and whispered. In the shadows between towering columns and beneath star-painted ceilings, women found their most profound connection to the divine. Yet even in this realm of gods and goddesses, the constraints that bound Egyptian women to earthly hierarchies followed them into the sacred spaces they desperately sought to claim. Religion permeated every breath of ancient Egyptian life, like the morning mist over the Nile. From the moment a woman opened her eyes to greet Ra's dawn light, until she whispered evening prayers to Nut, the star-covered sky goddess, her world pulsed with divine presence. But this spiritual landscape, rich as the black soil of the delta, was also carefully mapped by male authority that determined where women could walk and where they must not tread. The great temples that dominated Egypt's cities were not merely places of worship, but cosmic machines designed to maintain the balance between earth and heaven. Within their walls, an elaborate hierarchy governed every ritual, every prayer, every sacred act. At the apex stood the high priests, always men who alone could enter the innermost sanctuaries and commune directly with the gods. Below them, a carefully ordered procession of religious officials carried out the daily business of keeping the universe in proper alignment. Women found their place in this divine order, but it was a circumscribed place, hedged about with restrictions that reminded them constantly of their secondary status, even in the eyes of the gods they served. The highest position most women could hope to attain was that of chantress, a role that sounds almost quaint to modern ears, but carried genuine spiritual weight in ancient Egypt. These women were the voices of the temples, their songs rising in haunting harmonies that were believed to please the gods and maintain cosmic order. Consider Iset, whose story emerges from the painted walls of her tomb in the Valley of the Kings, an extraordinary honor for a woman of non-royal birth. As a chantress of Amun, she dedicated her life to the service of one of Egypt's most powerful deities. Her days began before dawn, when she would join other temple women in the careful rituals of purification that preceded their sacred duties. They bathed in sacred pools, donned fresh linen garments, and prepared their voices for the songs that would accompany the morning awakening of the god. The role of chantress required not just musical ability, but deep knowledge of religious texts, ritual procedures, and the complex mythology that gave meaning to every gesture and word. These women memorized hundreds of hymns, learned the proper pronunciation of ancient sacred formulas, and understood the symbolic significance of every instrument they played. Their sistrum rattles, their drums, their flutes were not mere musical instruments, but sacred tools that could channel divine power when wielded by properly trained hands. Yet, for all their knowledge and dedication, the chantresses could never aspire to the highest mysteries. The most sacred rituals, those performed in the innermost shrines where the god's statue resided, remained the exclusive domain of male priests. Women could sing to the gods, dance for them, offer them music and praise. But they could not touch the divine images, could not perform the daily rituals of feeding, clothing, and awakening the deities that were central to Egyptian religious practice. This exclusion was not merely practical, but theological. Egyptian religious thought held that certain sacred acts required a masculine principle, a divine energy that women were believed to lack. The priests who entered the Holy of Holies each morning were not just performing religious duties, but embodying the creative force of the gods themselves. In this cosmic drama, women were essential but supporting players, their voices providing the soundtrack to mysteries they could witness but never fully participate in. The frustration this must have caused for deeply spiritual women can only be imagined. Picture Isetnefret, whose name means beautiful of Re, standing at the threshold of the inner sanctuary, her voice joining with others in songs of praise, while watching the high priest disappear into the darkness beyond, carrying offerings to the god she could serve but never directly approach. The very architecture of the temples reinforced this hierarchy, with each hall smaller and more restricted than the last, until finally only one man could stand in the presence of the divine. But Egyptian women were nothing if not resourceful in finding alternative paths to the sacred. If they could not serve as high priests, they could become priestesses of female deities. If they could not enter the innermost sanctuaries, they could create their own sacred spaces within their homes. If they could not perform the great state rituals, they could develop intimate personal relationships with the gods that no male hierarchy could control or diminish. The goddess Isis emerged as perhaps the most beloved deity among Egyptian women, and for good reason. Her story spoke directly to their experiences and struggles. Isis was the devoted wife who searched tirelessly for her murdered husband Osiris, the grieving mother who mourned her lost son, the powerful magician who could heal and protect. In Isis, women found a divine figure who understood their pain and possessed the power to transform suffering into strength. The cult of Isis offered women roles that the traditional male-dominated priesthood denied them. As priestesses of Isis, women could perform healing rituals, conduct initiation ceremonies, and serve as spiritual guides for other women navigating the challenges of marriage, childbirth, and loss. These priestesses were not confined to singing and dancing, but could wield real religious authority within their goddess's domain. The temples of Isis buzzed with feminine energy as women gathered to share their troubles and seek divine intervention. Here, a young bride might come seeking fertility, an expectant mother, protection in childbirth, a widow comfort in her grief. The priestesses of Isis understood these concerns intimately, for they had lived them themselves. Their advice carried the weight of shared experience as well as divine authority. Hathor, the cow-headed goddess of love, music, and motherhood, offered another avenue for women's religious expression. Her festivals were occasions of wild celebration, where the usual social constraints were temporarily suspended. Women could drink wine, dance ecstatically, and express emotions that everyday life required them to suppress. The festival of Hathor was a safety valve that allowed Egyptian women to experience religious transcendence through joy rather than solemn ritual. These celebrations were not mere parties, but genuine religious experiences that validated women's spiritual needs and desires. In dancing for Hathor, women were not just entertaining themselves, but participating in cosmic renewal, their movements believed to stimulate the goddess's creative powers and ensure the continued fertility of the land. Their laughter and songs were prayers, their wine-flushed faces, reflections of divine joy. Yet even in these goddess-centered cults, male authority ultimately prevailed. The great temples of Isis and Hathor were still administered by male priests who controlled their finances, determined their policies, and mediated their relationships with the state. Women might serve these goddesses with passion and devotion, but they did so within structures designed and controlled by men who could withdraw their support or redirect the temple's resources at will. The domestic sphere offered women perhaps their greatest religious freedom. Within their homes, they could create sacred spaces that no external authority could regulate or restrict. Every Egyptian house had its shrine to household gods, and here women served as the primary religious authorities. They made the daily offerings, recited the protective spells, and taught their children the prayers that would guard them from harm. These household religious practices were not inferior to temple worship, but complemented it, addressing spiritual needs that the grand state rituals could not touch. When a woman whispered prayers to Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth, while placing amulets around her pregnant belly, she was performing a religious act as meaningful as any temple ceremony. When she burned incense to Bes, the dwarf god who protected children, while her little ones slept, she was channeling divine power for the most sacred of purposes. The religious lives of Egyptian women were thus characterized by this constant tension between exclusion and inclusion, between the barriers erected by male religious authorities and the creative ways women found to circumvent or transcend those barriers. They could not become high priests, but they could become beloved chantresses. They could not enter the innermost sanctuaries, but they could create sacred spaces in their own homes. They could not control the great temples, but they could find goddesses who understood and championed their concerns. This religious landscape shaped Egyptian women's understanding of themselves and their place in the cosmic order. They learned that the divine was both accessible and remote, that they could touch the sacred but only in prescribed ways, that their spiritual lives would always be mediated by structures of male authority. Yet they also discovered that faith could flourish despite constraints, that devotion could find expression even in limitation, and that the gods, particularly the goddesses, listened to their prayers with compassion and understanding. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of ancient Egyptian women's religious lives was not what they were denied, but what they achieved despite those denials. In their songs rising from temple courtyards, in their tears shed before statues of Isis, in their joyful dances for Hathor, in their whispered prayers to household gods, they created a rich spiritual tradition that honored both divine authority and human need, both cosmic order and personal longing. They may have been excluded from the highest mysteries, but they made their own mysteries, and in doing so, they ensured that their voices would join the eternal chorus of human devotion that still echoes through the ruins of their sacred spaces. The flickering oil lamps cast dancing shadows across the mud brick walls as Senebeth carefully arranged the small figurines on her household shrine. Her weathered hands, marked by years of grinding grain and weaving linen, moved with practiced reverence as she whispered prayers to Taweret, the hippo-headed goddess who protected women in childbirth. Outside, the Nile lapped gently against the banks. But here in her modest home, Senebeth created her own sacred space, a quiet refuge where the divine feminine could dwell among the ordinary rhythms of daily life. This was the spiritual world of ancient Egyptian women, not the grand temples with their towering columns and male priests conducting elaborate rituals, but the intimate personal religion that flourished in homes, at bedsides, and in the whispered prayers of mothers hoping their children would survive another night. While men dominated the official religious hierarchy, women carved out their own pathways to the divine, creating a rich tapestry of belief and practice that sustained them through the brutal realities of their existence. Egyptian women approached the divine through a lens of immediate need and desperate hope. Their gods were not distant philosophical concepts, but intimate companions who understood the specific terrors and joys of female experience. Taweret, with her fierce hippo head and swollen belly, embodied the dangerous power of childbirth, terrifying yet protective, monstrous yet maternal. She stood guard over women during their most vulnerable moments, when the line between life and death grew thin as papyrus. In homes throughout Egypt, women maintained small shrines dedicated to household deities, creating sacred corners where they could petition for protection, healing, and guidance. These weren't elaborate affairs, perhaps a simple niche in the wall holding clay figurines, a few precious amulets, and offerings of bread, beer, or milk. But within these humble spaces, women exercised a form of religious authority that the great temples could never touch. The goddess Hathor held special significance for Egyptian women, embodying love, beauty, music, and motherhood in a single divine figure. Unlike the stern, masculine deities who demanded fear and submission, Hathor invited joy and celebration. During her festivals, women would dance, sing, and drink beer in religious ecstasy, temporarily escaping the constraints of their daily lives through divine intoxication. These were rare moments when female pleasure and religious devotion merged. when being a woman became not a burden, but a blessing. Yet even in these sacred spaces, the limitations imposed by patriarchal society made themselves felt. While women could serve as priestesses, their roles were carefully circumscribed and ultimately subordinate to male religious authority. The most prestigious priestly positions remained closed to them, reserved for men who could claim direct communication with the gods. Women might carry sacred objects, sing hymns, or assist in rituals, but they could not perform the most sacred rites or enter the Holy of Holies where the god's statue resided. The role of God's wife of Amun represented perhaps the highest religious position a woman could achieve. But even this exalted title came with restrictions. These women, typically drawn from the royal family, were expected to remain celibate, dedicating their sexuality to the god rather than to mortal men. In a society where a woman's primary value lay in her ability to bear children, this religious celibacy represented both unprecedented spiritual authority and profound personal sacrifice. For ordinary women, religious expression often centered around the mysteries of birth and death, the two great transitions where divine intervention seemed most necessary and most possible. Midwives invoked protective deities during difficult births, reciting spells and incantations passed down through generations of women. These birthing rituals combined practical medical knowledge with spiritual practices, creating a female-centered healing tradition that operated alongside, and sometimes in competition with, official temple medicine. The goddess Isis emerged as perhaps the most beloved deity among Egyptian women, her story resonating with their own experiences of loss, grief, and resilience. As the devoted wife who searched tirelessly for her murdered husband's body, who used her magic to resurrect him long enough to conceive their son Horus, Isis embodied the fierce protective love that mothers felt for their families. Her tears were said to cause the annual flooding of the Nile, transforming personal grief into life-giving abundance for all Egypt. Women developed their own religious calendar, marking significant moments in the agricultural and domestic cycles with prayers, offerings, and rituals. The rising of the Nile, the beginning of harvest season, the first signs of pregnancy, all became occasions for spiritual observance. These practices created a parallel religious system that honored the rhythms of female experience, even as the official temple cult focused on cosmic events and royal ceremonies. Magical practices formed another crucial component of women's spiritual lives, blurring the boundaries between religion and practical problem-solving. Women crafted amulets to protect their children from disease, prepared love potions to secure their husband's affection, and performed divination rituals to predict the sex of unborn babies. These activities existed in a grey area between accepted religious practice and forbidden sorcery, requiring women to navigate carefully between helpful magic and dangerous witchcraft. The afterlife, too, held different meanings for women than for men. While wealthy women might be mummified and buried with elaborate grave goods, their tomb decorations typically emphasized their roles as wives and mothers rather than their individual achievements. The spells inscribed on coffins and tomb walls often focused on ensuring the deceased could continue to care for their families in the afterlife, extending maternal duties beyond the grave itself. Popular religious texts, like the Instruction of Ptahhotep, advised men on how to manage their households, including their wives' religious activities. Women were encouraged to maintain household shrines and perform daily rituals, but always under their husband's ultimate authority. This created a complex dynamic where women exercised real spiritual influence within carefully defined boundaries, wielding power that was both significant and constrained. The cult of the dead provided another avenue for female religious expression. as women took primary responsibility for maintaining family tombs and performing memorial rituals. They would visit burial sites regularly, leaving food offerings and reciting prayers for deceased relatives. This gave them a crucial role in maintaining the connection between the living and the dead, positioning them as spiritual mediators within their families and communities. Female religious networks also developed around shared devotional practices, with women gathering to participate in festivals, share religious knowledge, and support each other through spiritual crises. These informal communities provided emotional and practical support that the official religious hierarchy often failed to offer, creating bonds of sisterhood that transcended social class boundaries. Despite these rich spiritual traditions, women's religious lives remained fundamentally shaped by their subordinate status in Egyptian society. They could commune with goddesses who understood their struggles, create beautiful rituals around life's passages, and maintain sacred traditions that sustained their communities, but they could not challenge the basic structures that limited their earthly opportunities. The archaeological record reveals glimpses of this vibrant female spirituality through the countless small objects that women used in their religious practices: protective amulets shaped like the eye of Horus, figurines of nursing goddesses, magic wands inscribed with protective spells. These artifacts speak to a deeply personal and immediate relationship with the divine, one that prioritized protection, healing, and survival over abstract theological concepts. In the end, religion offered Egyptian women both solace and limitation, providing them with powerful goddess figures who validated their experiences, while simultaneously reinforcing their subordinate social roles. The divine feminine in Egyptian mythology was strong, magical, and essential, but always in service to cosmic order rather than personal liberation. As Senibeh finished her evening prayers and carefully covered her household shrine, she carried within her heart the quiet strength that generations of Egyptian women had drawn from their spiritual practices. They had created sacred spaces within patriarchal constraints, honored goddesses who understood their struggles, and passed down traditions that acknowledged the divine power inherent in female experience. Their religious lives were complex tapestries woven from hope and resignation, empowerment and submission, creating a legacy that honored both the sacred feminine and the harsh realities of women's lives along the ancient Nile. Through their devotions, their rituals, and their unshakable faith in goddesses who had walked similar paths, these women transformed spiritual practice into a form of quiet resistance, a way of claiming dignity and meaning in a world that too often denied them both. Their prayers rose like incense in the Egyptian night, carrying their hopes, fears, and dreams toward deities who promised that even in suffering, the feminine spirit could endure, protect, and ultimately transcend. The spiritual lives of women in ancient Egypt were far more complex and meaningful than the harsh realities of their daily existence might suggest. While they faced systematic exclusion from the highest ranks of the priesthood and wielded little formal religious authority, Egyptian women created rich, intimate spiritual worlds that sustained them through lives marked by struggle and uncertainty. At the heart of women's religious experience stood the great goddesses who dominated Egypt's spiritual landscape. Isis, perhaps the most beloved of all Egyptian deities, represented the ideal of motherhood, magic, and protective power. Women whispered her name during childbirth, invoking her protection as they faced the terrifying prospect of bringing new life into the world. Her story resonated deeply with ordinary women. She, who had searched tirelessly for the scattered pieces of her murdered husband Osiris, who had conceived and protected her son Horus through divine magic, who had triumphed over death itself through love and determination. Hathor, the cow-headed goddess of love, music, and motherhood, offered a different kind of spiritual connection. Her festivals were among the most joyous in the Egyptian calendar, filled with dancing, music, and celebration. Women would shake sistrums, bronze rattles sacred to the goddess, creating a rhythmic symphony that was believed to drive away evil spirits and invite divine blessing. In Hathor's worship, women found rare moments when their joy and sensuality were not only accepted, but sacred. Then there was Taweret, the hippo-headed goddess of childbirth, whose fearsome appearance belied her protective nature. Pregnant women kept small amulets of Taweret close to their bodies, believing her fierce visage would frighten away the demons that threatened both mother and child during labor. Her temples were places where women could speak openly of their fears, where midwives trained in both practical skills and spiritual protection. But women's spiritual lives extended far beyond the great temples and official cults. In the privacy of their homes, they maintained household shrines where they could practice a more personal, intimate form of devotion. These small altars, tucked into corners or niches, held offerings of bread, beer, and flowers. Here, women could pray without the mediation of male priests, speaking directly to the gods about their daily concerns, their children's health, their husband's safety, their own hopes and fears. The few women who did achieve formal religious roles walked a delicate line between spiritual authority and social constraint. The chantresses, women who performed sacred music in temple ceremonies, represented the highest position most women could hope to attain within the official religious hierarchy. These were often women from wealthy families, educated in the complex liturgical traditions that governed temple worship. Consider the story of Iset, a chantress of Amun, who lived during the 20th dynasty. Born into a family of priests, she was trained from childhood in the sacred songs and rituals that honored the king of the gods. Her voice, pure and strong, echoed through the great halls of Karnak during the daily ceremonies that maintained the cosmic order. Yet for all her skill and devotion, Iset remained subordinate to the male priests who controlled access to the god's inner sanctuary. She could sing the prayers, but she could not speak directly to the deity. She could participate in the rituals, but she could not lead them. Still, women like Iset found ways to exercise spiritual influence within these constraints. As chantresses, they became the living voice of divine worship, their songs carrying the prayers of the community to the gods. Their musical training often included knowledge of theology and mythology that made them informal teachers and advisors to other women. In a society where literacy was rare, especially among women, the chantresses served as living repositories of sacred knowledge. The role of God's wife of Amun represented the pinnacle of female religious authority, but it came with its own restrictions. These royal women, usually daughters or wives of pharaohs, served as symbolic brides to the god Amun. They wielded considerable economic power, controlling vast estates and commanding their own administrative staffs. Yet their authority was always circumscribed by their relationship to male power structures, whether royal or priestly. Women's exclusion from the formal priesthood did not mean they were absent from religious life. Many served as mourners at funerals, their wailing and lamentation believed essential for ensuring the deceased's successful journey to the afterlife. Others worked as temple servants, maintaining the sacred spaces, preparing offerings, and assisting in ceremonies. While these roles lacked the prestige of the priesthood, they provided women with legitimate religious vocations and often came with economic security. The practice of magic, which the Egyptians saw as a legitimate form of religious activity, offered another avenue for women's spiritual expression. Midwives and healers combined practical medical knowledge with magical rituals, using spells and amulets to protect mothers and children. These women became informal religious authorities in their communities, sought out for their ability to bridge the physical and spiritual worlds. Women also found spiritual meaning in the elaborate rituals surrounding death and burial. As primary mourners, they played crucial roles in ensuring their loved ones' successful transition to the afterlife. The professional mourning women, hired to wail and lament at funerals, were believed to help guide the deceased spirit through the dangerous journey to the underworld. Their tears and cries were not mere emotional expression, but sacred acts that sustain the cosmic order. The mystery cults that flourished in later periods of Egyptian history offered women new forms of religious participation. These secret societies, often centered around goddesses like Isis, provided initiates with direct spiritual experiences and the promise of personal salvation. Women could achieve high rank within these cults, sometimes serving as priestesses with real authority over ritual and doctrine. Personal devotion flourished in forms that bypassed formal religious structures entirely. Women made pilgrimages to local shrines, left votive offerings at sacred wells, and participated in folk festivals that blended ancient traditions with official religion. They told stories of the goddesses to their children, passing down spiritual wisdom through oral tradition that complemented and sometimes challenged the official teachings of the temple. The spiritual world of Egyptian women was also shaped by their understanding of Ma'at, the cosmic principle of truth, justice, and order. Women internalized this concept as both a religious duty and a survival strategy. By living according to Ma'at, by fulfilling their roles as wives and mothers with devotion and skill, they believed they were participating in the maintenance of cosmic harmony. This gave profound meaning to even the most mundane domestic tasks. Dreams and omens played important roles in women's spiritual lives. Egyptian women believed that the gods communicated through dreams, sending messages of warning, guidance, or blessing. They developed sophisticated systems for interpreting these divine communications, often consulting with wise women who specialized in dream analysis. A dream of Isis might foretell a safe childbirth. A vision of Hathor could predict joy and celebration. The calendar of religious festivals provided structure and meaning to women's spiritual lives. These celebrations, often lasting several days, offered rare opportunities for women to participate fully in communal religious expression. During the beautiful festival of the valley, when the gods were believed to visit the realm of the dead, women could commune with their deceased relatives and seek their guidance and protection. Women's relationship with the afterlife was complex and deeply personal. While the elaborate mummification and burial practices we associate with ancient Egypt were primarily available to the wealthy, all women shared beliefs about the continuation of existence after death. They prepared for their own deaths through good deeds, proper worship, and the accumulation of magical knowledge that would help them navigate the underworld. The role of women in preserving and transmitting religious tradition cannot be overstated. As primary caregivers of children, they were responsible for the earliest religious education of the next generation. Through lullabies, stories, and daily practices, they passed down the fundamental beliefs and values that sustained Egyptian civilization for thousands of years. Even in their exclusion from formal religious authority, Egyptian women created spaces of spiritual agency and meaning. Their faith was not the grand public religion of the temples and state ceremonies, but something more intimate and immediate. It was the whispered prayer to Taweret during labor pains, the offering of bread to the household gods, the tears shed for Osiris during his annual death and resurrection. This spiritual resilience was perhaps women's greatest source of strength in a world that offered them so little formal power. Through their devotion to the goddesses, their maintenance of household shrines, their participation in festivals and mourning rituals, they created rich inner lives that transcended the limitations of their social circumstances. Their faith was not passive acceptance, but active engagement with the divine forces they believed shaped their world. As we near the conclusion of our journey through the secret lives of women in ancient Egypt, we see how these spiritual traditions provided both comfort and agency. In a society that systematically denied women political power and economic independence, religion offered one of the few realms where they could exercise meaningful choice and influence. Their prayers, offerings, and devotions were acts of both faith and resistance, quiet assertions of their own spiritual worth in a world that too often denied their fundamental humanity. The legacy of these women's spiritual lives extends far beyond the borders of ancient Egypt. Their devotion to Isis spread throughout the Mediterranean world, influencing early Christianity and other religious traditions. Their understanding of the sacred feminine, their integration of daily life with spiritual practice, and their resilience in the face of systematic oppression continue to inspire and inform our understanding of women's religious experience across cultures and centuries. Yet perhaps no aspect of women's lives in ancient Egypt reveals the depths of their spiritual agency more powerfully than their role in the mysteries of death and rebirth. For while the grand temples and public ceremonies belonged to men, the intimate rituals of transformation, the whispered spells that guided souls through the afterlife, and the sacred knowledge of preservation were often held in women's hands. In the shadow of the Great Pyramids, in humble workshops scattered across the Nile Delta, women prepared the dead for eternity. These were not the famous male embalmers whose names were carved in stone, but the anonymous daughters, wives, and mothers who washed bodies with sacred waters, who knew which herbs would preserve flesh and which incantations would protect the journey ahead. Consider Henut Mahit, a woman whose tomb in the Valley of the Kings contains some of the most beautiful funerary papyri ever discovered. Though we know little of her life, her burial reveals a woman deeply versed in the mysteries of death. Her Book of the Dead, painted with exquisite care, shows her navigating the underworld with confidence, speaking the words of power that would transform her from mortal woman into divine spirit. The spells she carried were not merely copied from temple texts. Many bore the feminine touch of domestic religion, prayers for protection that had been passed down through generations of women, incantations that spoke of nursing children and grinding grain transformed into cosmic acts of creation and sustenance. Women's spiritual authority was perhaps strongest in the realm of magic, that fluid boundary between the sacred and the practical. In their homes, they wove spells into daily life with an expertise that sometimes exceeded that of professional priests. A mother protecting her child from illness, a wife ensuring her husband's safe return from a dangerous journey, a daughter honoring her ancestors. These acts were both mundane and miraculous, both necessary and divine. The medical papyri that survive from ancient Egypt reveal women's deep involvement in healing arts. While the famous Edwin Smith and Ebers papyri focus on surgical procedures typically performed by men, other texts show women as experts in gynecology, pediatrics, and the treatment of what we might now call psychological ailments. They knew the properties of plants, the phases of the moon, the times when the body was most receptive to healing. But their medical knowledge was inseparable from their spiritual understanding. Illness was not merely physical, but cosmic, a disruption in the divine order that required both herbs and hymns, both bandages and blessings. Women healers approached the body as a sacred landscape, understanding that true healing required attention to the soul as well as the flesh. In the great festivals that marked the Egyptian religious calendar, women played roles that were both public and deeply personal. During the festival of Isis, thousands of women would gather to mourn the death of Osiris and celebrate his resurrection. Their lamentations were not merely ritual performances, but expressions of genuine grief for their own losses, husbands claimed by war, children taken by disease, dreams destroyed by the harsh realities of ancient life. Yet in their mourning, they found transformation. The tears they shed for Osiris became the floods of the Nile that brought life to Egypt. Their cries of anguish became hymns of resurrection. Through identifying with the goddess, they discovered their own power to survive loss, to create life from death, to find meaning in suffering. The goddess Hathor, often depicted as a cow or a woman with cow's horns, embodied this feminine principle of nurturing and transformation. In her temples, women served as dancers and musicians, their bodies becoming instruments of divine expression. The sistrum, a musical rattle sacred to Hathor, was almost exclusively played by women, its rhythmic sound believed to maintain the cosmic order and drive away chaos. These women were not passive worshippers, but active participants in maintaining the universe itself. Their dances recreated the movements of the stars. Their songs echoed the music of the spheres. They understood that the feminine principle was not subordinate to the masculine, but complementary to it. That creation required both the seed and the soil, both the word and the silence that gave it meaning. Even in death, women's spiritual authority endured. The tombs of wealthy women were filled with shabtis, small figurines that would serve them in the afterlife. But unlike men's shabtis, which were often depicted as anonymous servants, women's funerary figurines sometimes bore the faces of other women, mothers, daughters, friends who would continue to support and protect them in eternity. The afterlife itself was imagined as a place where gender roles might be transcended. In the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, women could become farmers of their own divine acres, cultivating crops of stars and harvesting moonbeams. They could sail their own boats across celestial waters, no longer dependent on fathers or husbands for permission to journey. Some women achieved a kind of immortality through their roles as priestesses and oracle speakers. Though they could not hold the highest religious offices, those who served as chantresses and musicians in the temples were sometimes mummified and buried with great honor, their names preserved for eternity. They had found a way to transform their voices, their most feminine attribute in Egyptian thinking, into their pathway to divine recognition. The foreign queens who ruled Egypt brought their own spiritual traditions, creating a fascinating synthesis of religious practices. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh, was as much a religious innovator as a political leader. She identified herself not only with Isis, but with Greek goddesses like Aphrodite, creating new forms of worship that spoke to women across cultural boundaries. These foreign influences enriched Egyptian women's spiritual lives, offering new ways to understand the divine feminine. The mystery religions that flourished in the later periods of Egyptian history often placed women at their center, recognizing that the deepest spiritual truths were often best understood through the experiences of birth, nurturing, loss, and renewal that were central to women's lives. Yet even as these new spiritual opportunities emerged, the fundamental structure of patriarchal religion remained unchanged. Women's spiritual authority was still largely confined to the domestic sphere, their wisdom transmitted through informal networks rather than official institutions. They were the keepers of tradition, but they were not its official interpreters. The archaeological record reveals countless small shrines and household altars where women practiced their daily devotions. These humble spaces, often overlooked by scholars focused on grand temples, tell a different story of Egyptian religion, one where the divine was immediate and personal, where every meal was a communion and every lullaby a prayer. In these intimate settings, women developed their own theological understanding. They saw the goddess not as a distant figure to be worshipped, but as a presence to be embodied. They understood that the sacred feminine was not about perfection, but about resilience, not about purity, but about the ability to create beauty from chaos, life from death, hope from despair. The spells and incantations that women used in their daily religious practice reveal a sophisticated understanding of the interconnectedness of all life. They prayed not only for their own families, but for the fertility of the land, the prosperity of the kingdom, the harmony of the cosmos. They understood that their personal spiritual practice had cosmic implications, that their individual acts of devotion contributed to the maintenance of Mat, the divine order that kept chaos at bay. As the centuries passed and Egypt's independence waned under Greek and Roman rule, women's religious roles evolved but never disappeared entirely. The cult of Isis spread throughout the Mediterranean world, carried by women who found in the Egyptian goddess a figure who understood their struggles and honored their strength. In temples from Britain to Babylon, women served as priestesses of Isis, keeping alive the ancient wisdom of the Nile. These later developments reveal something profound about the spiritual legacy of ancient Egyptian women. Despite all the restrictions placed upon them, despite their exclusion from formal religious authority, they had created and sustained spiritual traditions that proved remarkably enduring. Their understanding of the divine feminine, their integration of the sacred and the everyday, their recognition that true spiritual power lay not in domination, but in transformation. These insights would influence religious thought for millennia to come. The women of ancient Egypt may have lived under the authority of fathers, husbands, and male priests, but in the realm of the spirit, they discovered ways to claim their own authority. Through their devotion to goddesses who reflected their own experiences, through their practice of domestic religion that honored the sacred in the everyday, through their role as guardians of the mysteries of life and death, they created a spiritual legacy that transcends the limitations of their time. Their voices, so often silenced in the official records, can still be heard in the prayers carved on amulets, in the hymns painted on tomb walls, in the ritual implements found in household shrines. They speak of a faith that was both deeply personal and cosmic in scope, of a spirituality that found the divine not only in the temples of the gods, but in the bodies of women, in the cycles of nature, in the eternal rhythm of death and rebirth that governs all existence. In honoring these women and their spiritual contributions, we recognize that the history of religion is not only the story of priests and prophets, temples and texts, but also the story of countless unnamed women who found ways to touch the divine and bring its transformative power into the world. Their legacy reminds us that true spiritual authority cannot be granted by institutions alone. It must be claimed through the courage to seek the sacred, the wisdom to recognize it in unexpected places, and the strength to live by its light, even in the darkest of times. As we descend deeper into the shadowed realm of women's experiences in ancient Egypt, we find ourselves at a crossroads where the divine and mortal worlds intersect in ways both sacred and sorrowful. For if women's earthly lives were constrained by the rigid hierarchies of pharaonic society, their spiritual world offered something altogether more complex, a landscape where powerful goddesses reigned supreme, yet mortal women remained largely excluded from the highest echelons of religious authority. Picture, if you will, the great temple of Isis at Philae, its limestone columns rising like prayers toward the star-scattered sky. Here, in the flickering light of oil lamps, women would come to whisper their deepest fears and most desperate hopes. They sought the protection of the goddess who had reassembled her murdered husband's scattered body, who had breathed life back into death itself, who understood better than any deity the profound anguish of loss and the fierce determination of love. Isis was perhaps the most beloved of all Egyptian goddesses, and for good reason. She represented everything that women aspired to be: devoted wife, protective mother, skilled magician, and wise healer. Her story resonated deeply with the experiences of mortal women who knew all too well the pain of losing loved ones, the terror of childbirth, and the constant struggle to protect their families in an uncertain world. When women prayed to Isis, they were speaking to a goddess who had walked through the valley of grief and emerged victorious. But alongside Isis stood other powerful feminine deities who offered different forms of solace and strength. Hathor, the cow-headed goddess of love, music, and joy, presided over the more celebratory aspects of women's lives. Her festivals were among the few occasions when women could abandon their usual restraint, dancing and singing with an abandon that was forbidden in ordinary circumstances. The sound of sistrums, the sacred rattles associated with Hathor, would fill the air as women shook off the weight of their daily burdens and remembered, however briefly, that life could hold beauty and pleasure alongside its hardships. Then there was Taweret, the hippo-headed goddess of childbirth, whose fierce appearance was meant to frighten away the demons that threatened mothers and newborns. In a world where maternal mortality rates were staggering, Taweret represented the divine protection that every woman desperately needed during her most vulnerable moments. Amulets bearing her image were among the most common religious artifacts found in Egyptian households, testament to the universal nature of women's fears and hopes. Yet for all the power and reverence accorded to these goddesses, the religious establishment of ancient Egypt remained firmly under male control. The highest priestly positions were reserved for men, as were the most sacred rituals and mysteries. Women could serve as priestesses, yes, but their roles were often limited to specific functions. They might be chanters or musicians, dancers or incense bearers, but they were rarely permitted to perform the most important ceremonies or to hold positions of real authority within the temple hierarchy. This created a profound contradiction at the heart of Egyptian religious life. The very goddesses who were worshipped as the most powerful forces in the universe were served by institutions that systematically excluded women from positions of influence. It was as if the divine feminine was honored in theory while being marginalized in practice, a pattern that would echo through many subsequent civilizations. Consider the role of the god's wife of Amun, one of the few religious positions that granted significant power to women. This title, usually held by royal women, came with substantial wealth, landholdings, and political influence. The god's wife was considered the earthly consort of the god Amun, and her celibacy was meant to ensure her complete devotion to the deity. Yet even this exalted position was ultimately defined by its relationship to a male god, and the woman who held it was expected to adopt many traditionally masculine attributes of kingship to legitimize her authority. The ordinary women of Egypt found their spiritual expression in more humble but perhaps more authentic ways. They created household shrines where they could worship in private, free from the elaborate protocols of official temples. They passed down oral traditions of prayers and chants that spoke to their particular needs and experiences. They developed their own networks of religious knowledge, sharing remedies, protective spells, and ritual practices that addressed the specific challenges of women's lives. Magic, in particular, became a realm where women could exercise a form of spiritual authority that was often denied to them elsewhere. Egyptian magical papyri contain numerous spells attributed to women or designed for women's use, incantations to ease childbirth, to protect children from disease, to win the love of a reluctant suitor, or to defend against the jealousy of rivals. While officially the practice of magic was regulated by male priests and scribes, in reality it was often women who preserved and transmitted the practical magical knowledge that ordinary people relied upon. The burial practices of ancient Egypt also reveal the complex relationship between women and religious authority. While women were generally mummified and buried with the same care as men of their social class, the religious texts and spells that were meant to guide them through the afterlife were often adaptations of formulas originally written for men. The famous Book of the Dead, despite its importance to both sexes, was primarily conceived from a male perspective, with women's spiritual needs treated as secondary considerations. Yet women found ways to assert their religious agency even in death. Some female mummies have been found with personalized versions of protective spells, suggesting that women or their families insisted on religious texts that spoke more directly to feminine experiences. Wealthy women might commission their own funerary equipment, including coffins decorated with images of protective goddesses, rather than the traditional male-oriented deities. The goddess Mut provides another fascinating example of how women related to divine feminine power. As the mother goddess and wife of Amun, Mut was often depicted wearing the double crown of Egypt, symbolizing her role as a divine queen. Yet her worship was particularly popular among women of the middle classes, who saw in her a model of maternal authority that transcended the usual constraints placed upon mortal mothers. Mut's festivals became occasions for women to gather, share their concerns, and collectively honor the divine feminine in ways that the male-dominated official priesthood might not fully understand or appreciate. The persistence of goddess worship throughout Egyptian history, even as political power remained concentrated in male hands, speaks to something fundamental about women's spiritual needs and aspirations. These goddesses offered models of feminine power that transcended the limitations of earthly existence. They were creators and destroyers, healers and warriors, wise judges and passionate lovers. In worshipping them, women could imagine possibilities for themselves that their society might deny them in practice. The cult of Isis, in particular, would eventually spread far beyond Egypt's borders, offering women throughout the Mediterranean world a goddess who understood their struggles and honored their strength. The mysteries of Isis provided a form of spiritual initiation that was open to women as well as men, creating one of the few religious contexts in the ancient world where women could achieve genuine spiritual authority and recognition. As the great temples of Egypt fell into ruin and the old gods gave way to new faiths, the legacy of these powerful goddesses lived on in the hearts and minds of women who had found in them a reflection of their own divine nature. Though the society that created these deities might have constrained women's earthly power, it had also given them something precious, a vision of the feminine divine that could never be entirely suppressed or forgotten. In the end, perhaps this was the greatest gift that ancient Egyptian religion offered to women. Not just comfort in their suffering or hope for the afterlife, but a profound recognition that the feminine principle was an essential part of the cosmic order. Even if mortal women were denied their full share of earthly authority, they could take solace in knowing that at the highest levels of divine reality, feminine power reigned supreme. The goddesses watched over them, understood their struggles, and offered the promise that in the realm of the sacred, women's voices would always be heard. The Secret Lives of Women in Ancient Egypt, Part 12. As we reach the end of our journey through the sands of time, into the lives of women who walked the banks of the Nile over 3 millennia ago, we find ourselves standing at a crossroads of understanding. The shadows are long now, the sun setting on our exploration. But in that golden light, we can see more clearly than ever the complex tapestry these women wove with their lives, their faith, and their quiet acts of resistance. Throughout our travels, we've witnessed how Egyptian women lived within a world of profound contradictions. They possessed legal rights that would have seemed revolutionary to their sisters in Greece or Rome, yet they remained bound by invisible chains of expectation and tradition. They could own property, conduct business, and seek divorce, but they could not escape the fundamental truth that their society viewed them through the lens of their relationships to men. They were daughters, wives, mothers, widows, but rarely simply themselves. In the realm of the sacred, we discovered perhaps the most fascinating paradox of all. While living women were largely excluded from the highest echelons of religious power, the divine feminine loomed enormous in Egyptian consciousness. Isis, with her outstretched wings of protection, Hathor dancing with joy and fury, Sekhmet breathing divine wrath, These goddesses were not distant figures, but intimate companions to women navigating the treacherous waters of daily life. In their temples and shrines, in household altars and whispered prayers, women found spaces where their voices could rise, where their pain could find expression, where their hopes could take wing. The spiritual lives of Egyptian women were rich with paradox and possibility. Excluded from the formal priesthood, they became the priestesses of their own domestic temples. Denied access to the sacred mysteries, they created their own rituals of meaning. Unable to read the official religious texts, they developed an oral tradition of prayer and practice that flowed like an underground river through generations of mothers and daughters. In the spaces between official religion and personal faith, they carved out territories of the soul that belonged entirely to them. We've seen how beauty became both blessing and burden, how the pursuit of divine perfection led women to paint their faces with toxic substances, to bind their bodies in uncomfortable garments, to transform themselves into living representations of goddesses who demanded such sacrifice. Yet even in these acts of apparent submission, there was agency. The woman painting her eyes with kohl was not merely following fashion. She was participating in a sacred act, transforming herself into something powerful, something that could look upon the divine and not be destroyed. The cycles of life and death, birth and rebirth, that governed the Nile also governed women's existence. Like the great river itself, their lives followed patterns both predictable and mysterious. The floods of childbirth brought both life and death. The harvests of middle age offered both abundance and scarcity. The droughts of old age demanded both acceptance and resistance. Through it all, they endured, adapted, and found ways to thrive within systems not designed for their flourishing. Perhaps most remarkably, we've discovered how these ancient women created networks of support and resistance that operated largely invisible to the historical record. In birthing chambers, where midwives whispered ancient incantations, in marketplace conversations where information flowed like currency, in the quiet moments between mothers and daughters, where wisdom was passed like precious stones, women built communities of knowledge and care that sustained them through the darkest hours. Their religious practices reveal this most clearly. While men dominated the official temples, women created their own sacred spaces in homes and hearts. They developed intimate relationships with protective deities, crafted personal rituals that addressed their specific needs, and maintained traditions that connected them to the cosmic forces that shaped their world. These weren't pale imitations of male religious practice, but rich, complex spiritual lives that acknowledged the particular challenges and gifts of being female in ancient Egypt. The goddesses they worshipped reflected their own complexity. Isis was not merely a mother, but a magician, a protector, a figure who could resurrect the dead and navigate the treacherous waters of political intrigue. Hathor was not simply a goddess of love, but a force of cosmic joy and terror, capable of destroying humanity in her rage and rebuilding it in her mercy. Sekhmet embodied the fierce, protective power that every mother needed when defending her children. These were not gentle, domesticated divinities, but powerful forces that matched the intensity of women's lived experience. In their magical practices, we see perhaps the clearest expression of women's spiritual agency. The love spells, protection charms, and healing rituals that archaeologists have uncovered reveal women who refuse to accept powerlessness as their fate. They might not have been able to control the great forces of politics and war, but they could influence the intimate spheres of love, health, and family. They could call upon the gods for aid, could shape reality through ritual and prayer, could claim some measure of control over their destinies. Even in death, women found ways to assert their spiritual identity. Though they might be buried in their husbands' tombs, many managed to secure their own funerary equipment, their own protective spells, their own provisions for the afterlife. The beautiful coffins and canopic jars that survive in museums today tell stories of women who understood themselves as complete spiritual beings, deserving of their own journey through the underworld and their own place in the eternal realm. The legacy of these women extends far beyond the borders of ancient Egypt. Their goddess traditions would spread throughout the Mediterranean world, with Isis becoming one of the most widely worshipped deities of the Roman Empire. Their magical practices would influence European folk traditions for centuries. Their understanding of the divine feminine would resurface in various forms throughout history, offering alternative visions of spiritual power and sacred relationship. But perhaps their most important legacy lies in their example of resilience and adaptation. They show us how women have always found ways to create meaning, community, and spiritual fulfillment, even within systems designed to limit their possibilities. They remind us that resistance need not always be dramatic or public to be effective. Sometimes the most powerful acts of defiance are the quiet ones, the daily choices to maintain dignity, to protect what is sacred, to pass on wisdom to the next generation. As our journey through their world comes to an end, we can see these ancient women not as distant figures trapped in an alien past, but as our spiritual ancestors, women whose struggles and triumphs echo in our own time. They faced questions that remain urgent today about the nature of spiritual authority, the relationship between personal faith and institutional religion, the ways that gender shapes religious experience, and the possibility of finding the sacred in the midst of ordinary life. Their voices, muffled by centuries of sand and silence, speak to us still. In the museums where their artifacts rest, in the archaeological sites where their homes once stood, in the temples where their prayers once rose, something of their spirit endures. They remind us that history is not just the story of kings and conquests, but of countless individual lives, of women who loved and lost, who struggled and survived, who found ways to touch the divine even when the divine seemed impossibly distant. The secret lives of women in ancient Egypt were lived in the spaces between official history and personal truth, between public conformity and private resistance, between human limitation and divine possibility. In those spaces, they created something beautiful and enduring, a tradition of female spirituality that honored both the darkness and the light, both the earthly and the eternal, both the individual soul and the cosmic forces that shape all existence. Their story is not finished. It continues in every woman who refuses to accept that her spiritual life must be defined by others, in every person who finds the sacred in unexpected places, in every act of quiet resistance that preserves what is most precious in the face of overwhelming opposition. The ancient Egyptian women who painted their eyes with starlight and crowned themselves with flowers were not just decorating their bodies, but declaring their divine nature. They were not just following rituals, but creating them. They were not just surviving, but transforming their world, one prayer at a time, one act of love at a time, one moment of transcendence at a time. In the end, perhaps that is their greatest gift to us, the reminder that the sacred is not housed only in grand temples and official ceremonies, but lives wherever human beings gather to honor what is most precious, most mysterious, most worthy of reverence in existence. The women of ancient Egypt may have lived and died thousands of years ago, but their spiritual legacy continues to illuminate the path for all who seek to find the divine within the human, the eternal within the temporal, the extraordinary within the ordinary circumstances of daily life.